Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this month's edition of Carpe Diem Prescriptions. My name is Shrish Netke, and we have with us today Sendil Thangavelu, Corporate Director of Analytics and Data Management for Flextronics. Sendil, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, Shrish. It's great to be here.
Great, great. So now, Sendil, you have done analytics and data management across a lot of different companies. I guess you were at PG&E, Toyota, and more recently at Flextronics. And you also teach at the UC San Diego. You teach a course on analytics at UC of San Diego. So you have a lot of broad experience in this area. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
So I think we're very curious to know what your take is on big data and its implementation over the next with all your years of experience. So again, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Yeah. Great to be here, Suresh. And yeah, over the years, I've across many domains and across many large, small, medium enterprises, I've implemented data analytics solutions. So I've cultivated kind of an opinion and approach to this, and I'm going to talk from my personal experiences across these enterprises that I've worked for. So first off, I think there is a varied understanding on what big data is. So I wanted to start off by level setting, from my perspective, what I think big data is. And I think
that's important because a lot of different people have different views of what that is, right?
That's right. So it's actually an amalgamation of quite a few things, and I want to kind of break it down. So big data, in the simplest term, refers to data scenarios that grow so large and complex that they become awkward to work with using conventional data management tools. Now, if you really analyze this description, this is intentionally subjective and is a moving definition.
Okay, so it is subjective by design.
By design, exactly.
Okay.
So why is this subjective? That's subjective because depending on the type of enterprise or organization or the business domain that you're in, what is big data to you might be peanuts to somebody else, right? So that's why it's subjective. And it's also a moving definition because there's a technology aspect to big data. So as the technology evolves, what is big data today in a year's time probably could be small or regular data. Right? So that's why it needs to be subjective and a moving definition. Now, the other aspect of this big data, so what we just talked about is the situation. It is caused by certain characteristics of the data.
Right.
And those characteristics, I think the easiest way to understand them and the most popular way to understand them are the 3 V's that we find, I think, by Gartner.
Right.
The volume, velocity, variety of the data.
Right.
There are a few more V's. I think I've even heard as many as 8 V's.
Yeah.
Past, like value and what have you.
There are 8 fourth V's.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So, that's a good lens to understand the characteristics of the data. Now, the data itself has caused the situation that we just talked about, which is so growing, so complex and voluminous that you find it difficult to deal with regular conventional technologies. The third aspect, so we just talked about 2 aspects. One is the situation, the characteristics of the data.
Right.
The third aspect of this is the technology and capability that has come on board because of the situation. So I think it's really great. You have a problem. You have a certain tool set and technologies that help you solve the problem.
Right.
So big data is actually a combination of all of these 3 aspects. So if you go into a conversation with this understanding, when somebody says, hey, I want to work in big data, I want to do something with big data to solve a business problem, this kind of a threefold definition helps you understand where people are coming from.
Right. So let me ask you this our audience is primarily executives from large enterprises. And the question is, why should this phenomenon, if you want to call it that, matter to big enterprises? Is this only for big companies, small companies? And how do people know that they're ready for this stuff? How do they know that they've, you mentioned the word threshold before. How do you know the threshold of implementing big data?
That's a great question. I think that is the fundamental question lurking in people's minds at all levels across the enterprise. Right? So the big data, this phenomenon, is causing several advances. So let's talk about that a little bit. One is the business-facing front-end and visualization aspects are getting more intuitive, right? So
okay, so it's easier to understand.
It's easier to understand.
Yeah.
The back-end data management capabilities are getting more and more sophisticated because of all these technologies and tools and capabilities, right? So so the demand that you see from the end users is significantly different from what you've seen in the past from the
right.
users, right?
Users are more educated, if you will. They have a better idea of what they want.
Exactly, and they read up and they understand all this innovation that is happening in the marketplace. Now, why should it matter to an enterprise, and should it matter depending on the size of your enterprise? I think was one
yeah,
right. In the past, or maybe even until as recently as a year ago, big data was associated with large web companies and retailers. It was typically associated with mouse clicks and things like that. These guys have been pioneers and have made significant contribution to evolving big data. Right? So it is a fact that they pioneered some of these concepts and they put forth technologies that people have picked on and have started advancing those.
These people like Google and Yahoo and Facebook and those guys who have done the innovations around it. Yeah.
Exactly. So, Google's, Hadoop file system and MapReduce, that gave rise to Hadoop. Google's Big Table, was an inspiration for NoSQL, right? And so are some of the technologies like Dynamo from Amazon and Hive from Facebook. A lot of these have contributed to the ecosystem. Now, I think what is also happening is with the advent of open source systems, with the advent of cloud capabilities, big data is actually within the reach of even small and medium-sized companies. There are cost-effective ways of actually collecting data, harnessing that data, and there are also faster ways to market these capabilities within your organization. So it is eminently feasible, even for small companies or medium-sized companies, to actually go after and exploit this phenomenon called big data.
Right. Okay. Now, so when you look at the market research guys, they talk about enterprises in three categories of enterprise: those who are investing, those who are investigating, and those who are ignoring big data. Based on your experience in talking to a lot of companies, do you think that's a fair classification of people, and how many people are actually doing it, doing the investments, so to speak?
Right. I would broadly agree with those three categories. I think there is also a fourth category of enterprises that are ahead of the curve, that have been pioneers in the space, that are continuing to in-house, innovate on some of these capabilities in-house. So the companies, I think that we categorized as ignoring big data, I would actually think they don't know how to start, or they're struggling with what this big data is.
They haven't understood it.
They haven't understood the capabilities. They haven't understood how to actually start the journey. So a lot of companies are not necessarily ignoring, they just don't know where to begin, right? I think that would be a more accurate classification of the third category, and I think I would like to add a fourth category, which is companies or enterprises that are ahead of the curve already, that rest of the gang could actually look up to and see what comes out of those capabilities. Because especially in this space, what is happening is like what we've seen in the past, right?
Yeah.
These companies innovate and then contribute to the open source. So you do reap the benefit of these capabilities as these companies continue to innovate and be ahead of the curve.
Right.
It helps the larger society.
So I think one of the topics we wanted to cover on a broad level is the practice of big data, or the sort of your experience as a practitioner of big data. So let's say, how does one begin? Where does one start? How do organizations embark on this journey, so to speak?
Right. That I think that is a fundamental problem that everybody is trying to answer. Right. How do I begin, or how do I know? How do I even know if I need to begin? Right?
Yeah.
So let me get to that very quickly. But before I get there, to your previous question about the size of the organization and the big data.
Right.
I wanted to give you a specific example that I thought was very thought-provoking. There's this company up in San Francisco, which is a startup. It's called the Climate Corporation.
Right.
Now, it is a startup. It's not one of those big companies. What they've done is they've really harnessed the weather data that is out there for the asking, that has been captured by
public information.
Public information.
All right.
Yeah. It is actually being captured by a national infrastructure. They use the weather data. They marry up the weather data with crop yield data.
Okay.
And other parameters that help them predict the occurrence of a negative or an adverse weather event happening that will affect the farmer.
Okay.
So based on all this data that they've harnessed, they're able to sell insurance to a farmer that is probably somewhere out in North Dakota or Midwest, trying to raise, let's say, corn. The farmer, depending on their parameters and acreage, asks for insurance against an adverse event that happens. And these guys have all this information, and based on the analytic models that they run, they're able to predict the probability of occurrence of such an event, and based on that, they issue an insurance policy, right? So this is a very novel way of using data that was lying out there, right? That nobody, how interesting is weather data to you and me, right? Especially living in California, we don't necessarily look at weather all the time.
No, we don't. We kind of take it for granted, really. Yeah.
Exactly. So those are some examples that I think are very inspirational for any other company that wants to go into this area.
So this is very interesting. So you're talking about one small company selling insurance to another small company, so to speak, which is your gentleman farmer, and using big data to do that.
Exactly.
And publicly available information
to
sell insurance policies. So they've disintermediated, I guess, like a whole bunch of people in the process.
Correct. And it's a very novel space to be in. It is something that nobody else thought of, but used data that is all lying out there. Right? And I think the ability to do that was spawned by some of these capabilities that the big internet companies actually put out there.
Right. So there's a small company which has taken advantage of innovation that's already out there. Phenomenal. Okay.
So to your other question about, do I even know, how as an enterprise, as a practitioner in an enterprise, how do I know that I have to look at big data in a serious manner?
Right.
Because I might be actually having existing BI technologies and data warehouses and those capabilities that are actually helping me solve a large part of my needs. But how do I know that I have to look at big data?
So, I mean, we've got a picture here which talks about crossing the big data threshold. We can put that up for folks to see.
Right.
Yeah.
So I found this slide online, and the sources mentioned here. It's from an analyst from Forrester, and I found this to be extremely simple and very useful tool to understand understand whether you've crossed the big data threshold. Right. So you typically take the 3 V's that we talked about for big data, which is volume, velocity, and variety, and assess those measures against a few dimensions. Some of those are, how do you store data, whether it's persistent or transient? How do you rate yourself on those parameters? How do you process the data, which is your cleanse, enrich, calculate, translate, or run algorithms, analytics, etc., so on and so forth. And then how do you query or search that data, right? So you self-rate yourself against those 3 measures using the scale that is at the bottom part. And then if your score is somewhere between poor and struggling, then you need to look at big data. Then you know that you've crossed the threshold and you need to consider big data. And when we say big data, now you're thinking about, in this parlance, you're looking at maybe most likely the technology aspects of big data.
Right.
So I found this tool to be very useful. I found this useful as a kit that you can actually use in your presentation to your senior executives to say that, hey, you need to consider big data in a serious way now.
I suppose it provokes a lot of discussion too, a lot of self-discovery as well, in terms of what's really going on.
I like the word you use, self-discovery, and it's very simple. It's very simple to communicate, it's very simple to use, and it's very simple to actually rate yourself.
Okay. So in your experience, how has this worked out for companies? I mean, how have they used this to sort of embark on their journey of big data? What did they do first? What did they do second?
So I think a structured way of approaching the big data journey is very critical because there's a lot of exuberance out there in the market. There's a lot of buzzwords and a lot of exuberance about the capabilities. I think all of them are true, but you need to really filter that down to your specific situations, right? So how do you do that? The first thing is to really assess whether you cross the big data threshold, which you've done.
Right.
I also put this framework together, and it is a 5-step framework. Somehow, strangely, in IT, as you might have sensed, the other day I was reading a framework for creating internal cloud, and that also happens to be a 5-step process.
Yeah, so we can't really think beyond 5 steps. Really.
Yeah, and I think if you make it beyond 5 steps, it also it's too hard, it's too complex. So I didn't really have that in mind, but when I actually put this out there, when I created this, it turned out to be a 5-step framework. So it kind of validated my own thought process, actually. So I found this tool to be very useful. So let's step through this. I'll paint a big picture and then go from there. The first thing is to assess whether you've crossed the big data threshold, which we've actually done. So let's pretend for now that we actually have crossed the big data threshold.
And we have to do this.
Yeah. The next activity is identifying and prioritizing a business case. Now, this might sound like a bunch of platitudes, but there is actually an approach to this. The next slide, this slide, I've encapsulated an approach. What you do is specific to big data. You look at business areas that are suffering because of certain data issues, right?
Okay.
It could be that you needed external data sources, probably even exotic external data sources like XML and unstructured, semi-structured, and what have you.
Right.
That you're not able to exploit or you're not able to store or get access to. That could be one situation that is hindering certain business outcomes. It could also be that the depth or the volume of data that you need to be able to come to certain conclusions with a certain level of assurance is not available, or you're not able to do that because your current technologies don't scale, right?
Right.
It could be a combination of any of these things. You identify those business processes or business outcomes that are suffering due to some of these capabilities or lack of these capabilities. Then you categorize them into certain buckets. Typically, organizations sit up and listen to you when you're talking about new revenue streams, or when you're talking about innovation, or you're talking about optimization. Last but not the least, depending on the sector that you're in, especially in finance and what have you, compliance becomes a very critical aspect, right? So categorize them into any of these buckets or anything else that might be relevant to your organization or enterprise. And once you do this, then you want to prioritize, right? Let's say you really get lucky, and you identify maybe 6 or 7 initiatives that are really suffering.
Right.
And you've identified and categorized them. Now you want to really find out which ones do you go after.
Yeah, which are more important than others. Yeah.
Exactly. So how do you do that? Now, what you can do is to plot these initiatives on a scale, a simple scale of complexity versus value, right? So what you see here is, if you have an initiative that is low complexity, high value, that becomes your primary focus.
Right.
And then there might be some initiatives that are high complexity, low value, which you really hold and monitor. So you do the same thing for your near-term initiatives as well as your longer-term initiatives.
So how do you measure complexity here? What is the metric for complexity?
That's a great question. That can be across your spectrum. That could be in terms of the capability build-out, which might be more IT specific, so to speak. The other side of the equation is also, once you build this capability, once you build these insights, right, the capability that helps you derive insights, the other side of the aspect is the actioning on it, right? There might be complexities also to action on it. And those complexities could be your processes, it could be people, it could could be a political environment within the organization. So you have to take into account the entire spectrum when you talk about complexity.
Right.
So let's go upstream. Even category of business requirements. In some cases, you might have a slam dunk business requirement.
Right.
In some cases, they might be nebulous. So when you're starting out on this journey, you really want to start on something that is clear cut, that you can action on, that even within an organization, the change management is also fairly simple.
Right.
So you have to look at complexity across the spectrum, across all these areas to assess the complexity of what you're trying to do.
Okay. Very interesting. Now, if you were to let's go back to from our questions here. I mean, there seems to be a very large choice of tools and technologies in the market today. It's kind of, a lot of people think it's kind of overwhelming. Now, how do you, again, as a practitioner, because that's what you are a practitioner of, you've actually implemented some of this stuff before. How do you actually go about sorting through this chaos and complexity associated with just the technologies available?
Right. I think that is the plethora of options that you have out there is great, and at the same time, it is also mind-boggling. So if you look at the big data technology landscape here, and again, this is slightly outdated. I'm sure.
That's about this picture from October, I guess, but it's probably more complex now.
Yeah, exactly. It's far more complex now. And I was reading some articles recently. In the last 3 years alone, across Europe and the United States, there have been about 300 startups in the space of big data. So how do you actually, one, identify your business case, then map your business case to capabilities that are out there? I think that becomes a fundamental problem.
Right.
And if you're a company that wants to move fast, and most companies, almost all companies these days want to move very fast.
Right.
You don't have the luxury of time to be able to play around with a lot of these and then figure out, right? So you've got to make the right choices or near right choices, minimizing your risk. Right?
Yeah.
So if big data, I call it big data 1.0. It was all about technologies, but if you see now big data 2.0, we are now talking about out-of-the-box tools, right? So let me pick on one. If you're thinking about analytic services or social media, I would say the TV social media. I'll just pick on one. Bluefin is an out-of-the-box capability, right? So if that's the space that you're in, and if you really want to get something going in TV social media analytics,
Bluefin is the option there. Okay.
Bluefin could be one option where you're trying not to reinvent the wheel, but you're trying to adopt something that is out there and start looking at that and start cycling through and iterating from there, right? So it's really important to understand the ecosystem. It is also really important to understand the capabilities that are out there, even the data sources, the ready-made data sources that are out there, right? For instance, Zignite has APIs for all of financial market data.
Right.
So there are a lot of data sources that are out there. There are a lot of capabilities that are out there. So you need to have a fairly good understanding of what these can do and what these cannot do. Also, these companies kind of rise and fall, right? So there is an element of risk that you have to consider, right? I mean, you could be in a realm where you can take a lot of risk and look at something that is really very innovative, versus there could be these known players, big players that will sustain, that are also entering this market. So that is something that you'll have to navigate.
Now, there seem to be a lot of different choices here. So in your experience, how well are people doing in terms of navigating through these choices?
I think it has remained a challenge, especially with more and more coming on to the spectrum. It has continued to remain a challenge. So also, if you really want to find people that have tried many different options, it's probably not that easy to find people that have actually done a lot of this, right? For instance, Hadoop, I think, is gaining a lot of traction. You're seeing people use it in batch for distributed computing and things like that. Now there is also a big push to bring it mainstream more for the interactive kind of analytics, right?
Yeah.
So there people that have actually stayed with Hadoop for a period of time that have evolved with it, so they're able to compare and contrast and talk to you about different options. But if you go out of that, right, into other areas, right, you will still find that a challenge. So I think the key here is, as you evolve with these technologies as an enterprise, you learn a lot. You need to have a certain mindset. You learn a lot. If things fail, if technologies fail, you still retain that learning and use it for the next iteration that you use. I think that becomes very key.
So it's sort of a continuous learning process for everybody involved. Okay. Now, let me ask another question. I mean, somewhere in the past, we've talked about the concept of a mindset. I mean, and you mentioned it to me in the past. What is the big data mindset about? What does that mean?
That, it's a very important thing to consider. So this also goes to change management aspects within your organization. Given the evolution or the evolving nature, I might say, of big data, you need to have an entrepreneurial spirit, right? Big data.
It's not for the faint-hearted, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And you're also trying to solve some big problems that you were not able to solve before, right? Because of certain non-availability of technologies and things like that, right? So it also, in addition to an entrepreneurial spirit, I think you need to have that real drive to be able to go after those big problems, not give up, right? Go after those big problems, find out what the capabilities are that will help you solve those big problems.
Right.
And if you fail, not really give up, but be very resilient, right? That is one aspect. The other aspect is within the organization, you also need to be able to bring about a change management. Right? Cultural aspects, you need to be able to navigate the cultural aspects within that organization.
Yeah.
For instance, your analysis or your capability, the outcome of building that out might point the organization in a certain direction, versus what you've been doing for the last 10 years might point you in a different direction. So to be able to turn the corner, to bite the bullet and really assimilate some of these capabilities requires change management. So I think that mindset is very, very critical for big data to succeed.
So without the mindset, you really can't make. You have to have it's a frame of mind to be able to address this problem. That's interesting. Okay. Now, can you? I guess let's talk to something about what people are familiar with. So, can you compare how, let's say, business intelligence or BI has evolved and how big data is evolving? Is there any parallels between the two? And I guess the more important question is, have you seen this movie before in terms of BI to say this is where big data is going to head in the future?
Right. I like your analogy. Yeah, it's certainly unfolding in the movie.
Right.
So if you think about BI and data warehouses, right, I think we are at a point where for people that are involved or practitioners, people that have touched it and played with it, or people that have implemented, you conjure a picture of your data sources to the left. Then you have your integration capabilities in the middle, different paradigms, different architectures. Then at the other side, which is to the right, you have different paradigms like enterprise data warehouses, data marts and data repositories and what have you, and usage patterns around that, right? So I think we have more or less kind of stabilized on that kind of a picture. With big data, we are not there yet.
Okay.
We are still trying to figure it out, right? So I think we have ways to go before we can kind of get set on a picture like that. Now, the problems that we are trying to solve with big data is far more complex with the problems that we have tried to solve with BI, right?
Oh, really? This is a much more complicated.
This is a much more complicated problem set that we are trying to solve. And so what are the problems? Why is it so more complex than BI? I think the nature of the data, right? The variety of the data, the exotic nature of the data that we are trying to capture.
Exotic. Okay, that's a good word. I'm describing it. Yeah.
So I think that induces a level of complexity. The latency requirements, right?
Right.
Your ability to. BI was all about sense and respond. Now in big data, if you're talking about predictive analytics, You're talking about anticipating and shaping even before certain incidents occur, certain events occur, right? So those, by its very nature, induce certain complexities. So I think the movie will probably take some time to unfold for some of these pieces to actually fall into place. The other thing that I'm seeing is in BI evolution, the plug and play aspect is very well stabilized. So if you're looking at some
so one different combinations, they work well together.
So whether it is heterogeneous data, databases, the usual suspects that you have out there in the market, they talk to each other well. Whether you're talking about data integration capabilities, right? They talk to multiple databases. That is all kind of stabilized. Whether you're talking about reporting capabilities or BI, front-end BI capabilities, most of these tools out there in the market talk to many different types of repositories. That plug and play is not available in big data yet. So you might actually start your journey and get a fairly significant footprint on, say, one technology. Then you want to kind of build it out as an ecosystem. The other thing, I think, the other trend that I'm also seeing is you need BI and data warehouses to be able to leapfrog and jump board into big data, right? Big data by cannot stand on its own. So you're really talking about an ecosystem. So to kind of bring back to your question, I think the evolution is still going on. It'll probably be a while before it settles. But I think the key takeaway here is big data will be an ecosystem. I think the plug and play needs to evolve. I think it will also sit along with your conventional DW and BI that is in place today. And I think the best way that to really talk about this is, let me try to give you an example. If you're talking about a hospital that takes care of preemie babies, right? Let's say there are these sensors that are really collecting body parameters for these babies, and the intention is to really detect certain occurrences even before the baby starts showing symptoms, right?
In a very short window.
In a very short window, exactly. So you need to build some models based on which you look at the streaming data that is coming in, right? So how do you build those models? It's based on your historical data that you've collected in your warehouse. Because now your streaming data is not useful unless you have built these historical models, right? And streaming by itself is not useful because you don't have these models.
Right.
So you're kind of piggybacking on what you have that you already have on disk, and you're also using your streaming data. So people also, I think early on we talked about velocity of data. So when we talk about velocity of data, there is a nuanced approach that you have to take, because the velocity at which data comes to you is very different from the velocity at which you need to act on it. They may not necessarily be at the same speed.
Right. You may have to act on it much quickly, or you may have to act on it much slower.
Yeah. So in this case, in the preemie baby monitoring case, the streaming is not relevant if you don't have the historical data, right? And the historical data is not relevant if you're really not able to intercept certain events from happening, and for that you need streaming data, right? So by the same token, you're also talking about the right time. People talk about real time and all that. I think it's more important to really look at right time. Another analogy that's one of my favorites is, let's say you go to Starbucks, you want to buy a cup of coffee, you pay $5, you get some change, and you look at that piece of data in your hand, right? That dollar that you got back, which I think is a piece of data. You look at that, assess what you got, and then you put it back into your wallet. You don't try to dump it into your wallet, and then after 2 weeks, you look at what you have, right? Well, you might want to do that, but it's not the most optimal way of doing it. So the right time becomes critical. I mean, there's a smarter way of doing things at the right time versus you could do something at a later point in time, but it will just consume more energy and more cycles, right? So the velocity of data becomes very important.
Okay. So I know we have time for just a couple more questions here. I mean, again, from a practitioner's point of view, what are the typical pitfalls which can cause a project to fail or a project to derail? Human factor issues, or what actually typically is sort of the stumbling block in implementing a big data project?
I think If I break this down into three parts, one is the business case identification,
right?
Then the capability build out, and then the change management, which is
taking action,
taking action, right?
Yeah.
Of these three categories, I would say the middle part is relatively the easier part, even though we have to navigate across a plethora of technologies and capabilities that are out there. Identifying the business case, really categorizing them into the right buckets, and which ones do you go after, that becomes the key, right?
Right.
So the pitfall is, we talked about the big data threshold. If it so happens that you're fine where you are, then don't fall into this temptation and say, well, I need to do this big data project.
Okay.
It might very well be that you're at a happy place now, but continue to monitor, right? Don't do big data for the sake of big data.
Right.
Continue to monitor, and as kind of the ecosystem and the world around you evolves and the data that keeps coming at you starts evolving, eventually or inexorably, every company will start looking at data more carefully, big or smaller, medium. For instance, we never had this before, but today you can buy a baseball racket which has 200 sensors that will help you improve your game. Right? Internet of Things. All of these are contributing to big data. So somehow, if you're in a business, you will get sucked into it. So if today is not the point, then that's fine. Just don't fall into temptation. Continue to monitor, right? So that would be the first pitfall that I would ask you to avoid. The second pitfall is, as you go through identification of the business case, it might so happen that you identify certain business cases that you had never identified, but don't necessarily need big data. So that's a happy side effect. Go solve that problem elsewhere.
Right.
Different kinds of technologies, right? Now, so that is kind of the upfront piece, right? The middle part we talked about. I think you need to navigate that very carefully. The final part is the change management and acting on that insight. As you're working through your project, let's say now you're at a place where you've identified the big data project, you've identified the business case, you've got business buy-in. Right at that point, you need to really start paying attention to change management, right? Once you provide these insights, who are those stakeholders? Who are those people that will need to act on it?
Yeah, who have to take action on it, because that's where the rubber meets the road, right?
Exactly. So are those people on board? Do they trust the data sources that you're using? Do they trust the methodology that you're using? Do they trust the sample size of the data? Given the data quality problems that you've had, right? Which company does not have the problem? Everybody has the problem. Given the data quality problems, the outcomes or the business insights that you provide, will they trust on that? Will they have enough trust on that, the capability, the people working on it, the credibility of you as a leader?
Right.
Will they, if the insight points in a different direction, will they still act on it, right? So that does not come after you deliver this capability. That comes during the course of your planning. You're building out the business case. You're building out the business capability, right? So engage them all through the process. So when you do provide insights, they're willing and ready to take action on it.
So in a sense, you're saying that the operational guys have to be involved. The operational guys are going to sort of live and breathe this. Have to be involved in the project itself.
Right.
It can't be just thrown over the wall. Okay.
Right. And so those are areas, and I think you need to engage with people at all levels within the enterprise. C-level, of course, it's cool and sexy to engage with them. Like you rightly pointed out, Sirish, I think the operational guys, right, that need to act on this, even though there is a mandate right from the top, they're also the ones that are just as critical that you need to engage with. Right?
Okay. So, Sendil, this has been a very good discussion so far. There's always like one question we ask all of our guests here on Carpe Diem, and it's basically, what is that one piece of advice you would give to a Fortune 500 executive? What is your Carpe Diem prescription that you can share with our members?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think we are all trying to figure this out. Okay? We are learning and evolving. So I would say if you intuitively feel that you have a business problem that requires you to look at big data in a serious way, then you go through a methodical approach. Some of that we just laid out here. You go through a methodical approach of identifying what the business case is, right? And once you've done that and you've convinced yourself of the need for big data, then you go after it, right? Do not have self-doubts about whether we can achieve this or not. I think everybody around you is also trying to figure this out. Granted, there are a few leaders that have actually done this, they've solved this, and they're continuing to contribute to the society at large with these technologies and capabilities. But I would say spend a lot of time to methodically identify the business cases. Once you've identified the business cases, go after it. Also have the stamina to sustain when you have to evolve. And sometimes you might actually see some failures because of extraneous situations that are even outside your control.
Right.
There could be a disruptive technology that has come in, which is completely obviating the need for the current footprint that you have. So you might have many of those along the way, but have the stamina to persist, and I think you will be fine. I think you will.
So perseverance and mindset, I guess it goes back to your original comment about that. That's kind of your prescription for executives.
Right, but spend the upfront effort and the methodology and be methodical about identifying the business case, and then be also methodical about making sure that the actions are taken on the inside, and then continue to iterate. If those actions taken based on the insight that you provide are not necessarily proving out to be true, then be prepared to kind of iterate your analytic models and what have you. Right.
Okay, very good. So that's all the time we have for today's Sendil. Thank you very much. For those of you listening in, we were talking to Sendil Thangavelu from Flextronics about the big data, a practitioner's journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suresh. It's been a pleasure.
Okay.